time in the mountains, we were eventually able to play the instrumental role in getting those hostages released. It's an exciting story. We don't have time to go into it here, but you just never know where the payoff's going to be when you start engaging with folks. And the one thing I would just, well, I'll repeat it at the end, but respectful engagement is really the essential element if you're going to get along with these folks and be able to avoid some of the bloodshed. The other anecdote I'd share with you is back when the Taliban had taken over the Swat Valley, which is kind of a resort area up in the mountains of Pakistan. Heads were rolling all over the place, and we were conducting a workshop for 16 madrasas surrounding the valley. And toward the end of the workshop, one gentleman stood up. He was a madrasa leader, but he was also a terrorist commander in Lashkar-e-Taiba, the group that brought you the attacks on Mumbai. He stood up and he said a couple of things. He said, "I came here for one reason and one reason only, and that's to discredit everything you have to say. He said, but I find myself standing here now full of rage. Rage because for 26 years I have studied and taught the Quran the way it was taught to me." He said, "For the first time, I have sensed the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent." He said, "I now see that the right way to advance Islam is through peace, not through conflict. I'm going to change what I teach my students, and I'm going to tell them why." Well, I was bowled away with how brave it is to say something like that in mixed company in a context where heads are rolling. I suppose he was cut some slack because he was a terrorist commander. But we came back a month later to see what was going on, and sure enough, he was doing exactly as he said. And we had a CNN team along. They'd been after us for several years to document some of our work, so they were along. And he said it to CNN for God and the entire world to hear. And at that point, he said, "Enough, enough." I think he recognized how thin the ice was that he was on. But here's a gentleman who had enough of a reputation to be a terrorist commander, but also he was a teacher, and he'd been teaching the Quran all that time, and if you can just, seize upon the right passages, it's like with every religion, you can seize on the wrong passages and do a lot of harm, or you can look for the ones that promote the better, neighborly concern, the betterment of humanity and the like. But this is just, the ideas behind the guns. Now, we brought this all to a close with respect to our involvement several years ago because it was interesting, the timing. I sat down with our project director, who's a Pakistani American, who was a tremendous trainer and leader. I said, from this day forward, I don't want to ever mention our center's name in Pakistan again. I said, we're too widely known and we're too targeted. 3 days later, out comes a 7-page online jihadist journal article that's specifically targeting our work, speaking in very direct terms about it. I remember the quotes accusing us of, quote, venomous concepts like moderation and tolerance and women's empowerment and blah, 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 and which are caustic to Islamic traditional values. And so this was 7 pages worth, and at that point, the writing was on the wall. We really needed to disengage. Fortunately, 2 years earlier, we had put in place the legal framework for an indigenous NGO that we would one day staff up and pass the baton to, because our job is always to work ourselves out of a job. And so we did that in this instance, staffed it up. We took our project director, he was also our senior vice president for operations, but we sent him to, he and his family to Dubai, and he became the president of this Pakistani NGO. And when we transferred that, we had engaged some 2,900 madrasa leaders at that point. Now, as I said earlier, it's over 5,000. So didn't miss a beat, but it's a much safer environment now that we cut that American umbilical. Another thing that happened at that same time was the State Department, which had been opposed to our work for 5 years. Their embassy in Islamabad was not supportive of what we were doing. We couldn't figure out whether it was concerns about church-state separation or if it was just politically too hot to handle to say they were supporting something that had Americans messing around in Pakistani religious schools. Kind of tough to put forward in some circles. But they came over, a delegation came over to our office and says, we want to build our strategy around your work. Because they had finally wakened up to the fact that what we were doing, addressing these ideas behind the guns, was every bit as strategic as anything else that was taking place on or off the battlefield. And if you want to drain the swamp of extremism, you know, you don't do it with the bombs and bullets have their place, but all too often they spawn more terrorists as the cycle of revenge takes hold. But if you really want to drain that swamp, you know, if you can win hearts and minds through this respectful engagement that I'm talking about, that's the way you get there from here. So at this point, I'd like to cut it off here and take any questions that you might have. Mark, you?
I'll go ahead.
Okay.
So if I could sort of make a comment on having worked in Afghanistan and what you see in Tahrir Square, the so-called Arab Spring, which is really a term that came from Georgetown. This struggle within Islam between modernity and tradition is very topical, it's very visceral, and your work really gets to the root of how the United States should engage abroad with various communities. How do you sort of marry that with the dot mill communities, these young men and women that are getting ready to go into the field? You know, having seen some of these events in Afghanistan, what kind of advice would you give them?
I think the advice I would give is, first of all, you need to understand the limits on exactly what government employees can do. I would say very few, if any, could really engage in the sort of faith-based diplomacy I've been talking about, because right away you get wrapped around the axle about that church-state separation business. But you also, by definition, you have a political agenda. That is the agenda of your country, which takes away from the balanced neutrality that you need to project when you're dealing with both sides. But what I would encourage you to do is to look for opportunities. NGOs can do that, okay, if they're so equipped to do it. I don't know of another NGO that does quite what we do in terms of faith-based diplomacy. But we actively use the faith piece in our conversations with them. And the interesting thing is that I, as a strong card-carrying Christian, am better received by a Sunni than a Shia would be. You know, so all they care about, if you're talking about Islam, they care about the monotheistic dimension and the fact that you've got a strong faith. But if you try to get into the business of watering it down and saying all faiths lead to the same goal, you know, you get in trouble. So you don't go there. But using your military chaplains in an effective way, I can't tell you how useful that can be. And some of them are very good. Some of them are also ill-suited for that kind of work. I had the pleasure, this is before 9/11 in 2001, of leading a team that trained all Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard chaplains in religion and statecraft. And the U.S. Navy bought all 1,300 of them a copy of this first book we put out called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. And the whole idea was to try to enhance the ability of the Sea Service Commands to practice preventive diplomacy. And you know, because the Sea Service Commands aren't on the cutting edge of our involvements overseas. That was all well and good. About a third of the chaplains were very enthusiastic about it. Another third were quite willing to give it a try, and another third, that's not why I signed up. So as you might imagine, that's a spectrum that will prevail in just about any walk of life that you're talking about. I did author an article for the Naval Institute Proceedings very early 2002 I think it was, or right at the end of 2001, was called "We Ignore Religion at Our Peril," and it was a challenge to the line community, to you folks, to expand the rules of engagement for your military chaplains so that you could permit this kind of improved collaboration, understanding, developing trust with local religious leaders. Lots of good things can come out of it, but it's all about engagement. It's all about engagement. And I would encourage you to think of the bombs and the bullets as kind of the last resort, but don't subscribe too quickly. I think in the United States we've made that mistake any number of times recently. We could do other things along these lines and be more effective. So look for those opportunities. Just see who's doing what out there, and see if there's not creative ways that you could bring that to bear in a way that will be helpful to everyone.
So I'd like to get a couple of midshipman questions.
So do you have a particular life experience or educational experience that you feel like particularly prepared you for the work you do now?
Do I have a particular life experience of what?
Particularly prepared you for the work that you do now?
The question was, did I have a particular life experience that prepared me for the work I'm doing now? It's a great question. How it happened was rather circuitous. I was teaching at Harvard University mid-career master's level courses, and we were focused on international security, and we were focused on nuclear doctrine at the time. And I got to thinking about how we and the Soviets were spending trillions of dollars and rubles on weapon systems, the sole purpose for which was they not be used because we were enhancing deterrence, while half the rest of the world starved to death. Then, wearing that same hat, I had another thought, which was, probably the United States was second to no one in history in terms of our ability to mount a strong defense to keep the peace. I said, but I thought we were pretty inept at making peace. And then I had another hat. I had been involved with the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington for some time, and I had seen how individuals operating on the basis of their own personal religious faith were able to reconcile differences between peoples, between factions, sometimes bringing wars to a halt with no one the wiser for how that took place. And I thought if I could capture that kind of activity in a compelling way and make that known, available to policymakers and diplomats, there might be opportunities for governments to reinforce it, to build upon it, but never try to own it because it would discredit it with the political agenda, but to create a new synergy for peacemaking that didn't otherwise exist. And we have, I think that has shown its worth in any number of tough neighborhoods around the world at this point. We've been at it for 17 years, and we've been blessed. We haven't lost anyone, and we've gone in harm's way any number of times. So we're properly humbled by the fact that, for example, with the madrasa thing, we're mindful that the United States played a very key role in planting the seeds of jihad in the madrasas in the first place. We were trying to grow holy warriors to evict the godless Soviets out of Afghanistan. So the Soviets left, then we left. We come back, they're doing what we trained them to do, only they changed targets. So as you might imagine, us working in that arena, we work with a degree of humility. And we openly have mentioned that on a couple of occasions, which just blows them away. They're not used to people being honest, but it's worked well. The more transparent you can be, the better it is.
One more question in the back.
Sir, I was just wondering, what approach did you take to be able to sit down with enemies who have, with our country's enemies who have so much animosity towards the West and our way of life that probably just days or weeks before you sat down and talked with them, they were shooting at U.S. troops? What approach did you take to be able to convince them to listen to what you have to say? And the second question is, do you believe that if you were a diplomat or working for the government, that they would have been more reluctant or refused to have this sat down and talk to you at all?
I didn't get the whole first question. Did you? Can you remember what it was?
Sort of, could you, go ahead.
Sir, with your anecdote of sitting down at the meeting with the many Taliban leaders, despite their prejudices against the West, how did you convince them to actually take the measure of sitting down and talking with you? And do you think that they would have been a government actor?
Good. Did everyone hear that last question? It was how did we convince the Taliban commanders to sit down and talk with me? Well, it came from an invitation from a Taliban commander who wanted to understand what America wants, and that started a process. And whenever we go anywhere, we always partner with indigenous organizations that already command the respect and trust of the people that we need to work with, so we're not starting from ground zero. So one of our two indigenous partners over there, who is a Wahhabi leader of some renown, spent an entire month rounding these people up in Afghanistan to come across the border for this meeting. And one of the things, you know what we forgot to do? We've got this video. Do we have time to show that real quick? I've got a short 4-minute clip that I just want to show you, and I will get to your questions once I understand them a little better. It was hard to hear you.
لیکن بدقسمتی تھی اسلام میں اس کی کہیں اجازت نہیں ہے.
Why should a child say yes, why not no to militancy?
الحمدللہ یہ پہلے یہ تھا کہ ہم تو ایک روح پر دیتا تھا، ایک روح پر دیکھ رہا تھا، اس کے آگے پیچھے اس کا پس پردہ اس کا بات تولنے کا ہمیں نہ موقع ملتا تھا، نہ ہم یہ گوارا کرتے تھے کہ اس کا بات تولے. چینج تبدیلی اس وقت سے آئی کہ میں نے پہلا ورکشاپ اظہر صاحب کی قیادت میں، اس کی رہنمائی میں، اس کی لیکچر میں ہم نے وہاں شمولیت کی.
کیونکہ ایک ہوتا ہے کرٹیسزم، تنقید، اور یا فیڈ بیک، جیسے کہتے ہیں ہم لوگ کبھی کبھی ایک دوسرے کو فیڈ بیک دینا، اور دوسرا ہوتا ہے کریٹیکل تھنکنگ، ہے نا. کریٹیکل تھنکنگ اس چیزوں کو توڑ پھوڑ کر سوچنا. اللہ میاں نے تو تنقیدی سوچ بچپن میں بچے کے اندر ڈالی ہوتی ہے. وہ ہمارا ایک بہت اچھا ماشاء اللہ سے کرتوت ہے بڑوں کا، جو کہ ہم اس کو ختم کر دیتے ہیں. پتہ ہے کیسے؟ ایک زمانہ ایسا آتا ہے کہ بچے کی ایک ایسی عمر ہوتی ہے جس میں وہ ہر چیز میں پوچھتا ہے یہ کیوں نہیں، یہ کیوں، یہ لائٹ اتنی برائٹ کیوں ہوتی ہے، یہ گراس اتنی گرین کیوں ہوتی ہے. ڈپینڈ یہ کرتا ہے کہ تنقیدی سوچ کو ابھارنا وہاں سے شروع ہو جائے گا. اسی لیے تو آپ کو باپ بنایا ہے. بلکہ بہت زیادہ لوگ ڈیفینیشن جو علم کی کرتے ہیں وہ یہی کہتے ہیں کہ ابیلٹی ٹو آسک کوشچنس.
یہ تو ہم جو سوچتے ہیں کہ یہ کہ امریکہ کے ایجنڈے کے لیے کام کر رہا ہے یہود، اس میں کتنا امریکہ کے ایجنٹی کا کردار اس سے ثابت ہو رہا ہے، اس پر سوچیں. یہ تو دین اسلام کے لیے، مسلمانوں پر جو بلیم ہے، مسلمانوں پر جو داغ ہے، ان کی مٹانے کے لیے. اور یہ تو مسلمانوں کی کریڈٹ میں یہ بات جا رہی ہے. آپ لوگ یہ کہتا ہے یہ کرتا ہے، جتنے آپ لوگوں کے ذہن میں ہیں دہشت گردی کے بارے میں، انتہا پسندی کے بارے میں، سب اس کے آپ سب مسلمان لوگ ٹھہراتا ہے. تو یہ جب آپ سے یہ سنا نا تو میرے ذہن میں تھوڑا فراخ دلی پیدا ہوگی.
There are so many ways that Haji Ayyub has changed that surprised us as well, especially me.
میں نے امریکہ میں جب دیکھا الفاتحہ کا، جب ہم نے وزٹ کیا تو وہاں پر جب میں نے دیکھا تو آپ یقین کریں میرے آنکھوں میں آنسو آ گئے. وہاں امریکہ میں تو لوگوں نے ان سے وہ حق نہیں چھینا کہ آپ الفاتحہ میں کیا کر رہے ہیں. तो मैं लुत्फ़ अंदोज़ भी हुआ और एहसास भी हुआ कि काश जैसे हमारे मुल्क में भी हो, ऐसे इदारे हमारे मुसलमान हैं, वो बेस्ट मुसलमान हैं, अपनी मुसलमानी पर कायम हैं, लेकिन कोई उसको तंग नहीं करता है। लेकिन यहाँ के हालात कुछ और है, काफ़ी डिफरेंस है। यहाँ पर कॉलेज में जो लोग पढ़ते हैं ना, तो वो मदरसे के लोगों को अकारत की निगाह से देखते हैं, और यहाँ पर मदरसे में जो लोग पढ़ता है ना, तो उनके लिए जो कॉलेज के जो लोग हैं ना, उनकी निगाह में वो भी कुछ नहीं है।
And he decided to build a whole school named after Al-Fateh Academy in Virginia and follow the similar model of that school.
Let me just tell you that the gentleman with the white beard, it was his compound in which I had that meeting with the Taliban commanders. And in the wake of that meeting, he made his living by renting construction equipment. Al-Qaeda came in and confiscated all his construction equipment. And furthermore, they tortured 2 young men who were involved in providing security for the session. Later, by the way, he's also thought to have given sanctuary to bin Laden right after 9/11. He came to a first workshop with the intention of killing our project director. He was going to assassinate him. When he heard that it wasn't an American agenda, but it was talking about how Muslims could become better Muslims, he became a champion of ours. And that's one of the things that has just blown me away, is how courageous these folks are, because when they become champions of ours, they subject themselves to a lot of potential trouble. Well, he came over to the United States. We had a group of madrasa leaders come over about 4 years later, and we ran into one another again and renewed ties, good handshakes and all. He invited me to come visit him again. And so I asked our project director, I told him I'd be happy to, but I asked our project director, how could he do that when he paid such a terrible price the first time I came? He says, I don't know, I'll go ask him. So here's what he said, and this is very instructive because this is very cultural. He says, I would rather die than not provide hospitality to someone I like. So it's, it's very humbling. But I'm remiss because I still owe you a couple answers. Could you just do it again, only louder, so I can hear better?
Actually, if I could dismiss the group and then he can come down and have a face-to-face with you.
Sure.